Carolyn Steel, and I'm a London-based architect, and about 10 years ago I brought out a book called Hungry City, How Food Shapes Our Lives, and the book was about exactly what it says on the tin, essentially the fact that feeding cities is an extraordinarily difficult thing to do, and the fact that we don't think about it because we live in a modern city and, you know, food arrives as if by magic, and, you know, after this we're probably going to have a lovely dinner, and neither of us will really, well, you might know, but, you know, I won't know really where the food came from. And so if you live in a modern city like this, it seems that we've solved the problem of feeding cities, but in fact that really isn't the case. So my argument in essence is that food shapes our lives, both in ways that we do realise and understand. So for example, when we do have dinner, you know, we will be socialising around food, and this is a very fundamental human thing to do, and a very nice thing to do, I might add. But also it shapes a lot of things that we aren't necessarily so aware of. So for example, it shapes our landscapes, it shapes our cities, it shapes our bodies, it shapes the way we think, it shapes our habits, it shapes our economics, our politics, you know, our socialising. So it's literally everything. And the fact that we don't see this is really interesting, because it's something to do with the fact that we live in, you know, a post-industrial society, and that's really hidden the most important connection, you could say, in our lives, which may not be apparent, but it's between us and nature. And this is something that I call the urban paradox. So the paradox is that we think of ourselves as living in cities and as urban, and we talk about ourselves as living in cities. But in reality, because we're animals and because we have to eat, we dwell in a very more real sense in the natural world. So there's a paradox here. And the paradox is, and here I like to use Aristotle's term. Aristotle calls us political animals, which I think is a brilliant term because it sort of describes a dilemma of how we should live as humans. So political animal. Political means we're sociable. It means we live in groups. It means it matters to us that we live together. Animal means we need sustenance from the natural world. So how do you solve those two problems? Well, obviously, if you want to be political, if you want to be sociable, living in a city is a great thing to do. You know, it's how we've solved the problem of being sociable, if you like. But how does that solve the problem of being an animal? Not very well. Actually, it makes the fact of being an animal a lot harder because we're far away from nature. And the further away we get from nature, the more this problem becomes invisible to us, actually. We don't realise that it makes us sick to be away from nature. So again, this is something that, you know, for me, we can really understand most powerfully through food. Because food is not only the thing that joins us most directly to nature. So, I mean, if you think about a plate of food in front of you, that's something you might just kind of eat somewhat mindlessly while you're, you know, on your phone or something. But those items on your plate are actually, I like to say, they're emissaries from another world. They're like little ambassadors from the natural world who've travelled maybe thousands of miles to come and sit there in front of you so you can eat them. And what's more than that, they're actually living things. They're things that have lived, that somebody has killed on your behalf so that you can live. So this is a really profound, extraordinary, very, very morally resonant thing that we do to eat. And when you think about food that way, when you think that food is a creature, a being, a living being that we've killed in order to live, it then makes you question, well, how come we think this should be cheap? I mean, this is a really, really weird thing that we've done in our society, that we've created the idea that food is something that should be cheap. And of course, there is no such thing as cheap food because, well, as I've just explained, if you don't value food, you don't value life. So I guess my proposal and what I want to talk to you about is what happens when you learn to see the world through food and you understand the true power of food and you start to value food. And the way we can do that is, I mean, I call this Sitopia. It's a word I made up. And basically it comes from the Greek word sitos for food and topos for place. So Sitopia is a way of describing the world as it's shaped by food, and it's basically the world we live in, but we don't realise it because we've designed the world to appear as if the food problem's been solved, and it hasn't been. So what I really want to try to explain is then how can we go from this sort of place that we've arrived at, and it's a kind of 200-year problem, if you like. I mean, it's a problem that's come from industrialization. How can we live a good life in a world where we don't value food? So the earlier cities were city-states, which basically means they were blobs of urbanity surrounded by farmland. And in fact, if you look at the first cities, which were the Sumerian cities of Uruk and Ur and Kish and Nippur, a little group at the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, they were basically the first human settlements really to make a concerted group effort, as it were, to permanently alter the landscape on a major scale. So they dammed the river and they flooded the land, so irrigated it, made it possible to grow crops where otherwise it would not have been. So there was, if you like, the creation of the first artificial landscape explicitly to feed a city. So it's at this point that you get the evolution of a relationship that's absolutely fundamental to civilization even now, but we're not necessarily very aware of, which is the relationship between the city and the countryside. So the countryside evolved alongside the city, and in fact you can't have a city without a countryside, and it's always been that way. You know, you have a kind of non-natural area where people are living, and you have a natural area that's modified to feed that. So that's how it works. And again, that refers back to the urban paradox I was talking about earlier. And it's a great arrangement. And it's actually no accident that those early cities were built on rivers either, because rivers obviously bring you fresh water, without which, by the way, I should say, there is no food. No food without water, very important to say. So whenever I say the word food, I'm also saying the word water in parentheses. Fish, obviously, but also very, very critically transport. And another important thing to say about the feeding of cities is that there's a number of problems associated with it. The first is growing enough food or producing enough food. So farming was the answer to that. The growing of grain made cities possible, in essence, because it was the first time there was a food that you could grow in enough quantities that there could be a large non-food producing population. And also it could be easily stored. And in fact, it was the temple in the middle of the city, which was not only the spiritual centre of the city, but also the administrative centre, and they organised the harvest, and they organised, you know, which fields were going to be harvested first. They gathered in the grain, they offered it to the gods, so the gods were happy, and then they stored it in a huge municipal granary, and then during the course of the year it was circulated out to the people. And that's how the first cities in the world fed themselves. And in modern terminology, we would say, therefore, that the first cities were city-states, in other words, city and country together, and they fed themselves via what we would call a large, centralised, spiritualised, municipal food hub, essentially. So this was a really, really good way of feeding cities, and it repeated again and again all over the world. So keep the city small, very important. So, you know, you've got enough land to feed it, and just have a kind of large centralised temple in the middle doing the distributing. So every city followed this pattern until one came along that completely blew it and went in exactly the opposite direction. You can probably guess which city this was. It was ancient Rome, which had 1 million citizens by the 1st century AD. So Rome blows the trend, it goes in the other direction completely. It was really the first great consumer city, and it began by feeding itself like all the other ones, and then it started to expand its empire. And it very quickly established that, you know, it could conquer areas like Sicily, Sardinia, the north of Africa, you know, great grain-producing regions, and just import its grain, because it had access to the sea critically. And then in its local hinterland, instead of growing grain, and eventually it was importing oil, it was importing pork from France, it was even importing fresh oysters from Britain at a certain point at the height of it. local farmers stopped growing kind of ordinary staple foods, and instead they started growing what was called pastio volatica foods, which were basically villa farming foods, so luxury foods for the kind of the banqueting market. And a lot of Romans actually thought this was a sign of the city's decadence because, you know, in fact, Marshall said, you know, we used to grow our own grain and import roses from Egypt, and now we import all our grain from Egypt and all we grow is roses. You know, it's a sign of the decadence of society. But again, it was a very successful model. I mean, but it was a very, very difficult model to maintain. So that, you know, there's no ideal solutions to any of this in essence. But what we would now call food miles is the only way you could feed a city bigger than, say, 20 or 30,000 in the pre-industrial world. All ancient cities, all the world's first cities basically followed this model. They were small and they were surrounded by their hinterland. And the same was actually true very famously of Athens, which was a polis. And polis just meant it was the state, and in fact it's the word from which we get our word politics. But it was also very consciously a state in which the urban core and the surrounding countryside were equally important. And actually both Plato and Aristotle talk about this at some length. They're very concerned about the size of the city. And the reason is, if the city grows too big, then it can't feed itself anymore, and then it's going to be dependent on somebody else to feed it, and therefore it can't be politically independent. And in fact, for both Plato and Aristotle, the ideal way for a city to feed itself was through what they called oikonomia. And oikonomia is from the Greek word oikos, which is house, and nomos, which means management. So it's household management in essence. What it is that ideally every citizen has a house in the city and a farm, and the farm feeds the house. And if the farm feeds the house, then the house is self-sufficient. And if you have lots of little houses, then that makes a village. And if you have lots of little villages, that makes a state. And so in Aristotle's Politics, he writes about the fact that the goal of the state is to be self-sufficient, because only when it's self-sufficient can it then be truly politically independent. And in fact, Aristotle warns against a thing he calls krematistike, which basically means making money for its own sake. And I think he would have found it quite ironic that our basis of the word economics, in fact, is oikonomia, is household management, because our idea of economics is the precise reverse, you could say, of what he was talking about. And that becomes quite interesting when you look at the conditions we find ourselves in now. So for about 5,000 years, the cities struggle to feed themselves, and as we've already seen, only cities like London and like Rome that had access to the sea could grow to any particular size because they were able to import their food from a long way away, do the food miles thing if you like. And then roughly 200 years ago, it all changed, and it sounds like a cliche to say it, but it did pretty much change overnight with the coming of railways. So railways changed three key things. The first is food, of course, for the first time can now be transported long distance very, very rapidly, and so it can stay fresh, so you can bring food from a lot further away. So this means effectively that cities are emancipated from geography. So up until this point, the size they could grow, where they could grow, absolutely constrained. Now they can basically go anywhere, any shape, any size. So the metropolitan carpet starts to spread, thing one. Thing two, food starts to become invisible. So, you know, today, you know, we just kind of wander into a supermarket, there's the food, we don't know where it's come from. That began to be the case with the railways, because what happened is people started to build sort of specialist food logistics systems, effectively. So the food might arrive in a warehouse, maybe at the bottom of a railway station, and it would be distributed to shops in the middle of the night. You'd wake up in the morning, there was fresh milk, you didn't know where it came from. So that's the beginning of that. And the third thing is that politicians, who right from the days of the temple in Ur and Uruk, through Rome, through Paris, not kind of including London, interestingly, although the city of London did control food, I mean, where you could buy and sell it, for example. But anyway, collectively, city authorities wiped their collective brow and said, thank goodness we don't have to be in control of feeding people anymore, because they hated it. It was a very, very difficult thing to do, a very politically contentious thing to do, because the food industry could take over. So this is a fundamental moment when politicians hand over the responsibility of feeding people to food companies. And of course, these are three consequences that we're living from today. So with the emancipation of cities from geography, the invisibility of food, and the abnegation of responsibility for feeding people. And they're fundamental to the problems we face now in feeding ourselves. Why do we waste food? Because we don't value it. This goes right back to the beginning and what I was saying about the fact that we live in a world where we seem to have solved the food problem. You just wander into a supermarket, there it is. We don't think about the hidden costs. In fact, there was a study done in the Centre for Environment in India that reckoned if you internalise the true cost of a beef burger raised on beef grown in the Amazon, on newly cleared land, it should cost $200, and not the $2 that we roughly pay for it. So that gives you some idea of the uneven playing field. We've created a world, we've created a society predicated on cheap food, and yet the real costs are being paid anyway, outside the system. So what are we going to do about it? And that's why I think what we need to do is not think about utopia, which can't exist, but Sitopia, food place, which does exist because we already live in it, because we already live in a world shaped by food. But we live in a bad Sitopia because we don't value the thing that shapes our world, which is food. But if we did value that thing, then it's revolutionary, actually. It changes absolutely everything. So that, in a way, is my proposal. And it's really just giving a name to something that already exists, because it's giving a name, if you like, to the food movement, which is absolutely about valuing food. So the very fact that I'm sitting here talking to you about food is a very encouraging symptom of the fact that over the last 10 or 20 years, for example, people have really begun to understand how damaging the way we eat is, and how by eating differently we can not only, quote unquote, save the planet, but also be much healthier and happier. So I really think food is a fundamental way of seeing how we can create a better, more sustainable society, to use that horribly overused word, which I usually try to avoid. And here's the really exciting thing. We have all the ideas already, because effectively what climate change is doing, what the global population growth is doing, is it's putting us right back where our pre-industrial ancestors were. And so if you look at how our pre-industrial ancestors fed themselves and fed the city, all the answers are right there. So the shorthand that I would use is that basically we need to put the economia back into economics, which means we need to go back to this idea that you feed yourself from your local hinterland, which means eating differently. It means eating much less meat and dairy. I think we already know that. Most people have clocked that, who have any eyes or ears open. It means eating less grain, less of this kind of very monothematic food, but actually eating in a much more variety. Because what it really is turning the whole, and this is something the chef Dan Barber talks about, it's turning the whole kind of logic on your head. It's not, ask not what I can demand of nature, but ask what nature needs of me. In other words, sorry, I put that in a slightly JF Kennedy-ish sort of way, but essentially what I'm saying is, and Dan Barber's whole third plate idea is that you see what nature wants to grow for you in a locality and you eat that. It's really blindingly obvious. But of course we need to recover from 200 years of doing pretty much the exact opposite of that. The ideal place for a political animal to live, as Aristotle and Plato knew, is with one foot in the city and one foot in the country. We want both. We want to be sociable, but we also need nature. So how can we construct a landscape that actually allows us to have both of these things? And for me, there's almost a formula for this, and it's called maximize the urban-rural interface. And this works at any scale. So basically, if you have a classic city-state, you've got, as I've said probably 8 times by now, a blob of city surrounded by countryside. So you've got, the edge between city and country is an ideal place to live, you could say, because you can get into the city and do your work, and then you can zap out into the country and relax. And in fact, if you look at the way rich people have lived all the way through history, this is precisely what they've done. So, for example, rich Roman senators, who had to be in the Senate every day, they also had their villa in the countryside. And this was otium and negotium. So otium is business, and negotium is business, from which our word negotiation comes, and otium is rest in the countryside. And by the way, their villas were all very productive as well. So it's this kind of ideal that only rich people have been able to do through history. So my quest, I guess, the thing I'm really sort of groping towards now is how can we construct a landscape where everyone gets to live in the ideal habitat of a political animal with one foot in the city and one foot in nature. And the beautiful thing is, as I say, that it can happen in any way, in any scale. So, for example, I now grow vegetables on the roof on the way up to my flat in central London. I didn't do this 5 years ago, it's a new thing, but it's transformed my life, because now my entire world, my sense of time is predicated around, I better start choosing which seeds I'm going to grow next year, and looking after the plants and harvesting them. My neighbour's watering them now because I'm here, And then I get to harvest and eat these plants that I've cooked myself, that I've grown myself. And it's a really fundamental, wonderful thing to make this reconnection with nature. And so it can happen at the tiny scale of me and my roof up to my flat. It can happen at the grand scale of, if you like, a garden city, which may be the designing of a new city. I mean, the city of Almere, where we're going tomorrow, that is a classic example where there's a master plan that incorporates food growing in the plan. That's extremely exciting to me. So there's many ways we can physically post-fit the city with food growing and design new cities so that there's a much closer relationship between city and country. But we can't do it without government intervention. So the market alone will not deliver this. In fact, the food system we have at the moment is the one the market delivers. So, as Lorenzetti knew 600 years ago, politicians have got to get involved in food. It's critical. The problem here is, as I said before, politicians around about 200 years ago wiped their collective brows and said, thank goodness we don't have to feed people anymore. The food companies did it for them. They like this. They also actually, by the way, like the idea of cheap food, because that makes all of their numbers stack up much more beautifully. And the other problem that we have is that we have vast consolidation in the global food system, which means that the biggest food companies, many of which you probably even haven't heard of, have annual profits way bigger than most national GDPs. So we have a power problem. But there are ways around it, the good news is. So, for example, if you look at the existing food system, I often, draw it as a tree. There's many, many producers, there's many consumers, and there's just this one trunk, which is, if you like, the big conglomerates who actually control the relationship between the producers and the consumers. But there's nothing stopping the producers and the consumers just meeting directly. So that's joining the roots to the branches, and that is basically what the food movement does, in essence. So lots of schemes like, community-supported agriculture, CSAs, organic box schemes, direct selling, all of these are ways of joining the roots to the branches. And what happens? The trunk, by the way, doesn't go away. It just loses its monopolistic power, because suddenly there's all these other things going on around the side. And by the way, if you think as I think, as I've learned to think, that a food system and a society mirror one another directly, they map onto one another, then if you want to live in a democracy, you can't have a food system like the one we have. Because sovereignty over food, sovereignty over what you eat, over your own body, is essential to freedom. So, if you like, I think, it's almost a kind of obviosity to say that to talk about food, the act of eating is a political act. It is a deeply political act. I think we need to get much more political through food. I think we need our politicians, we need to demand that our politicians step back in the ring and deal with this. But the beautiful thing is we can do it by valuing food. As individuals, we can value food. It would be great if governments would act and start to internalise some of the external costs of food as well. Industrial food would immediately become totally unaffordable, because it is totally unaffordable. You know, so put the cost of climate change, put the cost of pollution, put the cost of water depletion, soil degradation, obesity in the food, we wouldn't eat it. We wouldn't be able to afford it. So it's just, if you like, at one level it's almost a mind game that this food is unaffordable, but it's also a proposition, we need to make it unaffordable. So I guess Sitopia is a kind of call to arms for politicians, but also just for, you know, for us. I mean, it means, I mean, the reason I invented the word Sitopia is because utopia can be a really depressing concept, because it's ideal, but we can't have it, because, by the way, I should have said the word itself is a joke word. It can either mean good place or no place. So it's ideal, but it's over there. Sitopia's right here. So by valuing food, by eating differently, by paying the people who are doing it right, farming organically, farming with nature as opposed to against it, and changing the way we eat, we can literally, from the plate out to the universe, make a better world.